GM, where innovation goes to die. Okay, maybe that's unfair, although the reveal of the 2019 Camaro facelift that looked like a hemorrhoidal mother-in-law tells me that maybe there's a reason General Motors is likely the softest target in the North American auto industry. Even more than Ford. Even more than Stellantis, who I'd wager most people don't even think about. Because nearly everyone has some sort of beef with GM and what they've done to any number of their brands through inaction, or worse, by having ideas. I mean, isn't that sort of the issue with GM? That instead of focusing on improving brands under their umbrella, they focus on acquiring other brands and making them worse? I mean, it's like they just figure, well, we're never going to satisfy the people complaining that Pontiac and Cadillac aren't what they were, so let's buy Saturn, let's buy Hummer. And then badge engineer everything so that we basically overpaid for a bunch of intellectual property that doesn't do anything for us that we couldn't have done ourselves by just giving our existing brands a little more attention. At least then the company could have been better prepared for the rise in imports and the trend towards smaller cars. But hey, who needs to deal with the burgeoning import market when we can just buy Saab? We can strip away everything that made them unique and just keep nagging them until they aren't an embarrassment to the family. For Saab, it was like pulling up to your parents' house for Thanksgiving and they're still giving you grief for choices they had nothing to do with. You're still driving that. You haven't traded it. You're still driving that. What happened? I thought you got that job at the place with the thing. You're still driving that? That's not even American. And look, you don't need me to tell you how GM sabotaged the Saab brand. I spent 3.5 hours talking about it. The link is in the description, and you can listen to that on a drive or to fall asleep like I do with other people's overly long YouTube video essays because 90 minutes isn't long enough for me anymore. But what GM essentially did was snatch up Saab and instead of allowing Saab to actually be Saab, they shoehorned them into this weird little niche where they weren't European enough to appeal to people who found that sexy, but they weren't American enough to people who put mayonnaise on French fries. Saab 9.5 SportCombi. When you want the shoddy build quality of a GM car, but you also want the casual street cred that comes from driving a European car. Like, yeah, I want the credibility that comes from high repair bills. I want the credibility that comes from driving a car by a brand that doesn't exist anymore. I want the credibility that comes from filling my vape pen with menthol brain freeze instead of cinnamon toast crunch because I'm a real man with exotic, obscure passions. I don't like Netflix. I like puppet shows held at a trap house. I don't like boobs. I like arm hair, and lots of it. I don't like hanging out at bars to drink. I like hanging out at bars so I can flatline every asshole I hear who says they're a better driver after they've had a couple. I drive a Saab in the year of our Lord 2023. We're not the same, you sanctimonious prick. But I keep coming back to the idea of fairness. Is that a fair assessment of what Saab is? Because even while I truly do like Saab as a brand, I had very low expectations of their tenure under GM, and by extension, this car prior to driving it. And yet driving this car has changed some of my long-standing opinions about Saab and caused something of a critical reevaluation of the GM years. So what's the deal with this thing? Is it a true Saab, an original creation of one of Sweden's finest automakers, or a GM in overpriced H&M clothing? I'm Nick Roman, this is Race to the Bottom, and today we'll be driving a 2007 Saab 9.5 SportCombi. Somewhere in Sweden, man, you had to see them. Saab before they're bought by GM. Close your eyes, romanticize weird old Swedish cars. Now let me kick this off with something I'm not sure many Saab purists are going to want to hear. In some very important ways, Saab actually improved under GM. Maybe not in terms of aesthetics or character or innovation, But with GM resources at their disposal, Saab was delivering a more cost-effective product that didn't sacrifice the reliability and overall build standard that had come to define the company for generations. I'm not saying they were making their best cars ever, but it's not like they were just pumping out trash. We still got the 9.3 SportCombi, the 9000, the NG 900, cars that were divisive but memorable. Distinctive, still Saab. Yes, there was an erosion of the character and soul of Saab that was equal parts immediate and gradual. But to say Saab was dead in the water the minute GM bought them would be to oversimplify things. Sure, GM didn't really let Saab be Saab, but Saab also didn't seem to try all that hard to fit in with their new partnership, if you could even really call it that. As a dyed-in-the-wool Saab guy himself, Kyle here has his own collection of stories of any number of issues he's had across the nearly 20 different Saabs he's owned in his life throughout various different makes, models, and generations. He's one of the several people I turn to for help with the Saab RCR Stories script to check for any major omissions or errors. And I went through even more drafts of the script than I did for the AMC story, which is saying a lot. And if the Saab video can be said to be good, then Kyle is certainly one of the reasons why. In short, I trust what he says about Saab, which is why I wasn't necessarily expecting him to confirm a conclusion I was beginning to reach after about 20 minutes at the wheel of this car, because it runs contrary to what I would expect a Saab guy to believe. This 9.5, manufactured under General Motors, is actually better than some of the classic Saabs I've driven. I'm typically loath to give GM any sort of credit for things they did in the 2000s, but this car is genuinely better than it has any business being, considering it lacks much of what made Saab such wonderfully inventive little machines. Now, don't get me wrong, even if this is a better car, I can't actually say that I like it better than the OG 99 Turbo or the 900s of the world. But I also can't pretend that what we have here isn't a Swedish equivalent to something like a Toyota Corolla, just turbocharged and more idiosyncratic. Or maybe it's closer to a BMW, like one of the older ones. I don't know. Now I'm starting to get on a tangent, but what I'm saying here is that its Swedishness within the parameters of the General Motors relationship obviously isn't a bad thing. Although if you give me a million years, I don't know that I'll ever get used to the ignition column being in the center console. Now, the Saab 9.5 was introduced to replace the Saab 9000, and it deepened the company's investment in the executive car market. And they got the first generation off the ground in 1997 for the 1998 model year, just a few short years before the GM takeover in 2000. But this here is a 2007 model, and these GM creations have significant differences from the first 98 model year 9.5s, as the car would be updated several times under General Motors, like with the new front grille designs and tailgate in 2002, or the redesigned exterior in 2006, complete with new front lights and full red taillights, stiffer shocks, and updated instrumentation. But even then, these weren't necessarily bad things. They were just different. The aero trim got you wider tires, and all in all, you ended up with this almost sporty little saloon car that was comfortable but capable, yet fairly nondescript to passive observers, at least in its own time. I imagine now the rarity of Saabs on the road might cause a couple of heads to turn. But in 2007, was this really stacking up against the BMWs and Audis of the world? I don't know. The engine here is the 2.3-liter B235R, or the H motor. It's a dual overhead cam 16-valve Mitsubishi-sourced TD04HL-15G turbo. Oh, that's a mouthful. Overall, you were getting 256 horsepower and 273 pound-feet of torque from factory. It's basically the same power figures as all of the 9.5s sold over here in the final years of the GM tenure, more or less. Now, engines in earlier Saabs were differentiated by big T and little t. But after 2006, they all got the biopower name in North America, which just means that it's the full pressure, high output turbo, and it's E85 compatible, as the fueling has a flex fuel sensor. Thank you, Kyle, for informing me about that. Fuel economy figures are actually pretty equivalent between the automatic and the manual transmissions from what I could find. However, the automatics tend to get more consistently high fuel economy since the gearing is slightly better. Kyle has gotten as high as 36 miles per gallon at times, although his average is around 26.5. Still, it's impressive considering the low standards people often have for Saab under GM. And it's even more remarkable when you consider all the work Kyle had to do to this 9.5 to bring it back from the brink at which he found it. Kyle has replaced the exhaust with an OEM 9.5 stock system, replaced the fuel pump and sender preemptively, and replaced the turbo control valve and ignition cassette. In fact, he replaced the entire PCV system, the spark plugs, all the fluids, all vacuum lines, and configured the car for European equipment and light groups with a Tech 2 device. So there aren't really mods or upgrades here, just alterations to bring it closer to what it was back in 2007 with a touch of that European specificity. Because he bought this after it was posted for sale as a 4 parts listing with no pictures. No pictures! Dude was buying this sight unseen. No model information, nothing. Just a 1-line text post. Got it for $600, and only then because the car misfired when he started it. Because of an aftermarket ignition cassette the previous owner had installed just 2 months prior. So Kyle tossed it and replaced it with a 15-year-old junkyard cassette that happened to be a factory original and then drove the car home. This, despite being told by the seller that it needed to be towed. And yet, what happened? The car did its job. Because in keeping with the notion that a GM-backed Saab had the goods to deliver a consistently reliable product that wouldn't bankrupt you on repairs because of difficult-to-find parts, the 9.5 was holding up exceptionally well under Kyle's ownership, even as he undertook the effort to bring it back to the full glory of whatever trim this is. Because apparently I'm told the trim largely depends on how you run the VIN, or if Mercury is in retrograde, or whatever. But it may be either the anniversary trim or the aero trim, although either is technically true, I guess, since it has the aero brakes, suspension, and badging, but the anniversary seats and interior. When it comes to trims, I just err on the side of whatever's equipped mechanically, so I would lean towards calling this an aero. But I didn't think about that too much while I was actually driving the thing. The drive is decently smooth, although the turbo doesn't feel as punchy as I was expecting. But I didn't really experience turbo lag either. This is a better, more responsive automatic transmission than a lot of other fair-weather freeway cruisers I've driven. It has no problem with just chilling out in those low gears and holding them when you need it to, and letting you cartwheel your happy ass up the rev range when you want. Not that this is something you're going to want to take to redline, but it's not like it's a car for the terminally uninspired either, because you could potentially just go ham on this car. Fun is on the table with the 9.5. Because it feels like a car that was designed or at least engineered and manufactured to take a beating. You're not out here struggling under torque steer or the feeling that the suspension is straining under the weight of performance. This is a car as uncomplicated as my Camry and only just barely any sexier, but it's got surprising pull. It handles well. It's responsive. It looks good. It feels good. And even with a GM interior, it's still got enough of that Saab engineering to feel unique from similar offerings of its era. Is anyone going to celebrate this car another 10 years from now? Probably not. But it's a car worth going out of your way to drive because it shows that Saab had a lot of life left when it went under, even if the best of their quirkiness was being squeezed out of them in favor of badge engineering, cost-cutting, and cosmetic decline. But then all this does is make me wonder why Saab has managed to endure as a sort of cult figure while failing to achieve a more widespread popularity when it mattered. This is a good car, and yet it wasn't enough to justify keeping Saab around. It didn't sell, yet In the intervening years, there's a dedicated community of motorists who have held Saab aloft as an almost tragic figure in the history of the auto industry. And I suppose the reason for Saab's continued hipsterific relevance is written in that observation. We love a fallen hero. You ever see the movie Troy? It's based on the Iliad, but I don't think the line in question was actually ever written by Homer. But Brad Pitt's Achilles pretty much sums it up when he notes that any moment might be our last. Everything is more beautiful because we're doomed. You'll never be lovelier than you are now. We will never be here again. Saab endures for the same reason Romeo and Juliet has been relevant for half a millennium. Romeo and Juliet's romance was doomed, and because it was doomed, it was more beautiful. Because where's the beauty in something that lasts forever? Unchanging, intransigent, frozen in time. Yes, it can be beautiful, but it can never achieve transcendence through impermanence. A thing can't become legendary if it's always around. There's no path to heaven but through death. And look, I'm not saying Saab was always destined to fail. As I mentioned in the RCR Stories video, again, link in the description, Saab was put down by a combination of mismanagement, operational redundancy, and bad luck. And yet, while it wasn't inevitable, I don't think it was a perfect storm of unfortunate circumstances either. Saab had its time, but it didn't last. There's a romanticism to failure, the noble inability to achieve a goal. We romanticize it, and yes, I've contributed to this, and still do sometimes. But like anybody who ever had a relationship that blew up in their face and then didn't reflect about why it imploded in the first place, there's a tendency among purists to overlook Saab's culpability in their own failure. On the one hand, they were stuck doing what GM told them to do, and looking for ways to add some of their intrinsic Saabness to otherwise uninspired GM mandates. On the other hand, they also actively resisted becoming fully integrated into the GM brand, a move that made it all the easier for General Motors to just give them the boot when the company was bottoming out financially. Yes, GM ultimately killed Saab, even if their shambling corpse did continue to live for a couple more years in some form or fashion. But nobody expedited Saab's demise quicker than Saab themselves. However, nostalgia is the great equalizer in the continuum of merit, and it demands that we view those past Saabs, those 60s and 70s and 80s Saabs, and even some of the 90s Saabs, as an unsurpassable gold standard. When really, a lot of them are very, very good cars that still have glaring issues that Saab didn't have the support to solve. And yet, in Saab's defense, was GM the right kind of support? Well, no, probably not. Because they had a vision for what Saab should be that was diametrically opposed to what Saab actually was. It wasn't going to be that European prestige brand in North America, because it wasn't even that in Europe. No, GM had them share parts with Opel and other brands, and then took American executives who actually understood Saab, guys like Bob Hendry, who saw 6-digit sales numbers during his tenure, and foresaw a vision of Saab challenging BMW in North America, and transferred them to other divisions entirely, replacing those executives with people who didn't really get Saab at all. But Saab couldn't do it alone. It was a case of how, as a great Canadian vocalist once said, nothing's going right, and everything's a mess, and no one likes to be alone. Yet, even in their goals being unrealized, Saab has managed to persevere among enthusiasts in a way that isn't too far removed from an old rock group whose catalog is sustained by college bars and movie soundtracks, and whose 401k is the next nostalgia tour. They're always going to be around, even as the days of mainstream relevancy have fallen by the wayside, because there will always be people carrying that torch for them. Sure, maybe you go to a show and realize you can practically play aging rocker bingo for how many of the cliches they tick off, right down to the free space in the middle for pointing the microphone at the crowd to sing along because you can't hit those big notes anymore. But the idea that there are people who still want to be a part of that experience, going through all the old hits and even some of the songs from the less popular period, that means a lot. GM is Saab's Chinese democracy. It was their Saint Anger, their Cut the Crap, their Idlewild. But even while Outkast made Idlewild, it wasn't like it was an irredeemable record, you know? There are still good songs on that album. And even if there weren't, they're still the guys who made Stankonia. Saab still made the 900 Aero, the 99 Turbo S, the Sonnet. And even at their worst, Saab could still pump out a car like the 95 SportCombi, a car that's safe, reliable, and fun in a way that allows you to overlook the lack of cosmetic refinement or inherent Swedish quirks. It's a great car. A comprehensive car. There's a world out there in the multiverse where GM buys Saab, doesn't try to change a thing, and just funds whatever weird idea they have. And Saab is more receptive to being brought into the American fold to meet the demands of a consumer base that still valued smaller cars but were looking for other options as well. A universe where they never even bother with the 97X. Ugh. But then we don't get to choose the world we're born into. We just have to do our best with the hand we're dealt. And the Saab 95 SportCombi is probably the best Saab could manage under GM. But while that doesn't sound like I'm saying a lot, this car is beautiful and tragic in the potential it displays for what GM Saab could have been under the best of circumstances. I don't think it's going to take a whole lot of guessing to figure out where my thoughts are going to land here, but needless to say, as the 6th car for the race to the bottom, I don't see a spot for it in the bottom 5 standings. Big surprise. But as far as the bottom 5 goes, the standings are as follows. Just as a reminder, I still like the Ford Escape the best. The Kia Forte GT was a surprisingly acceptable car, even if it wasn't really a great car. The Hyundai Tucson is, the less said about that, the better. The Jeep Grand Cherokee Laredo, it was the race to the bottom leader for the better part of 6 months, and yeah, with very good reason. And at the very bottom, the current leader in the race to the bottom is the Nissan Sentra. I will be shocked, absolutely shocked, if anything can top that. Although I have since filmed another race to the bottom, and this bottom 5 list will be changing next episode. Something is getting kicked off, something is getting moved up or moved down, so definitely stick around for that, or keep your ear to the ground for that. But for now, I guess I'll wrap this up by saying thank you to Kyle for letting me drive his Saab. Links for other Race to the Bottom episodes are in the description, along with the link to my 3.5-hour RCR story on the life and death of Saab. Thank you guys for getting that over 1 million views and counting. And that'll be it for me. Thank you for watching Race to the Bottom. Thank you for supporting regular car reviews. Thank you for supporting me personally, for all of your comments, whether positive, whether constructive. I read them all, and I'm really appreciative of you guys, and I would love to be able to keep doing this for you for as long as I theoretically can. But for now, I've been Nick Roman. I still am Nick Roman, but this has been Race to the Bottom. Have a great week, everyone. Did Saab have to go? Don't know, don't know, don't know. Like a rock band on its 7th final tour. But they don't earn the same ire as a Sentra or a Laredo. Is it thanks to GM? Don't know, don't know, don't know. Would I buy a Saab? Don't know, don't know, don't know.